All right, now that we got our catchy opener done, let's go through 3,000 years of Mesopotamian history. There it is on the ancient map I showed you in the previous video on the current world map. But yeah, that here in green between the Tigris and Euphrates, around where modern-day Iraq is. So here's a quick timeline here, and there's also a timeline in the back of this chapter. I love the maps and the timelines and the Traditions and Encounters textbook. The visuals in this are awesome. By the way, I forgot something about Gilgamesh. It is the oldest work of literature in the world, and also that there was a flood story in there. Talk about Bible parallels. There was a story where Utnapishtim is telling Gilgamesh about a worldwide flood and building a boat and how the gods were mad because people had been sinful or just bad, and so they decided to flood the world. In that story, it rained 6 days and 6 nights, kind of like the 40 days and 40 nights in the Bible. And on the 7th day, it cleared up. So Utnapishtim sends a swallow out, but the swallow returns because it's still all flooded. And then he sends a raven out. The raven does not return, so he builds an altar on the mountain. And that's in the book of Gilgamesh as well. So talk about amazing Bible parallels. So first we're going to talk about the Sumerians. So that was the first major group in Mesopotamia. They ruled for over 1,000 years, between 3,500 and 2334 BCE, but they were not a single kingdom. They were a collection of city-states, as you can see on the map. Sorry about the blur, I don't know why that's happening, but anyway, Urartu, Uruk, Lachish, Babylon, Assur, and Nineveh, these all had basically their own kings and the rules in the city and outside the city. So not really an empire, just a collection of city-states. They invented the wheel. They invented the first mathematics as well. And they had the writing in cuneiform, which, by the way, lasted for over 3,000 years before it began to get displaced by the alphabet. We're going to get to that much later with the Phoenicians. But the other thing the Sumerians did is they built these massive ziggurats. This ziggurat right here is for Nanan-Sur. And that ziggurat took 5 years with 1,500 laborers working 10 hours per day. Ancient aliens, anybody? I don't know. I'm just being silly. But yeah, the ziggurats were these stepped pyramids. And as you can see, 100 feet. I'm trying to use standard, but you got metric units too. And metric is the unit everywhere else in the world. But since in America it's standard, feet and inches and miles instead of kilometers, and we get to maps and distances, I'm going to use that because it's the one that most Americans are most familiar with. There's the flood story of Gilgamesh. But basically, the Sumerian city-states dominated. In fact, around the year 3000 BCE, Sumer was the world's most populated place with about 100,000 people, compared to a world population, as you remember from the last chapter, of 14 million at this time. But eventually, the Sumerian city-states went into decline. And this first empire is not on here, but the first empire was Sargon of Akkad's Akkadian Empire, which was basically when Akkad took the region over. And yeah, I can't find the Akkadian Empire, so I'm just going to go right back there, which just shows Mesopotamia. But here's another story that might sound familiar to people who know the Bible. Remember the story of Moses in Exodus and how he was found in a basket floating down the Nile River? Well, Sargon of Akkad, the first guy in our Sargon, Hammurabi, Ashurbanipal, and Gilgamesh song that I sung in the last video, the Might Be Giants, were the Mesopotamians. Anyway, Sargon of Akkad was a basket case. He was put in a basket in the Euphrates River, and the king of Kish is not on that map, but it's down there kind of around Uruk and Ur and near the Persian Gulf. King of Kish had a gardener who rescued Sargon, and then the king of Kish adopted him. And what did Sargon do? Betrayed the king, staged a coup against him when he got older, and formed his own kingdom. And then, after that, he expanded from Akkad all over the region of southern Mesopotamia, actually ended up incorporating all of Mesopotamia with the Akkadian Empire. which was at its peak around 2300 BCE. Sargon went around with all his military and pretty much dominated the region, and cities didn't like him very much because as soon as he'd hit a city, he'd demand that they give food and shelter and all of that. And then he'd go around and do it to the next city, and eventually all of Mesopotamia became under Sargon's control. So the Akkadian Empire was an empire. The Sumerians were not. They were a collection of city-states. But Sargon created the world's first empire, and that was around 2300 BCE. 2334 BC is when Sargon came to power. His descendants tried to hold the empire together, but by about 2150 BCE, the Akkadian Empire collapsed. And now I'm going to go to my world history timeline to explain some of the reason why, mainly just resentment. And then there was a brief period of Sumerian Renaissance before, after about 2000 BCE, the Amorite kingdom or Babylonians rose up. But we're talking about the Sumerians, which is this red line, and then the Akkadian Empire was their first empire. And I didn't mention that these were Semitic peoples. Now, you've heard the term anti-Semite for being anti-Jewish, but Jews, Arabs, and many of the other people of the Middle East are Semites. They probably came from Arabia and migrated north. Nobody knows what ethnicity or language group the Sumerians were. It's very possible they were related to the Harappans of the Indus Valley going over to these other map because they traded with them a lot. And I'm going to show you that on a map later. There was a lot of trade between here, and in a couple chapters we'll study this river valley, the Indus Valley, which used to be India, post-1947 CE Pakistan, because the Muslims of India split from the Hindus of India and formed Pakistan. That's much later. That's modern world history. But anyway, the Indus Valley traded quite a bit, and you can see how it's easy to sail through the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman and Arabian Sea to do this. So it's possible that the Sumerians and the Indus Valley people were related. But in any case, the first Semitic group is the group of Akkadians led by Sargon of Akkad. And like I say, let's go back over to the timeline. You can see that that's going to be the Indo-Europeans in those dotted lines, but you can see that Semitic tribes migrate into Sumeria, and you got the Akkadian Empire. But what I really wanted to show you is that early Bronze Age is basically the Sumerians and the Akkadians. And then you're in the Bronze Age after that. So around 2200 BCE, there's this long dry period. The next chapter we'll talk about Egypt, and the Egyptian Old Kingdom ends due to 30 years of drought, first intermediate period. Although here it says 100 years of dry conditions worldwide. And somewhere in there, that's when the Akkadian Empire kind of collapses too. And there's a brief Sumerian Renaissance. That's kind of the first major cataclysm. Also in this era, the Indus Valley, we get to that, goes into decline. But then, after the Sumerian Renaissance, you have the old Babylonian Empire, also known as the Amorites, and they basically take power around 2000 BCE or so, and this would be Hammurabi's empire. Hammurabi's in power from 1792 to 1750 BCE. If you look at the orange there, you can see Hammurabi's empire. In fact, the whole code of Hammurabi is the first really well-known law code, and it's of course famous for the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But even there, you can see social class consciousness. Like if you punch out the eye of a noble, you get your eye punched out. But if you punch out the eye of a peasant, then you just have to pay a fine. So that was the empire of Hammurabi, and the Babylonian Empire based in Babylon. At its peak, you can see it covered pretty much all of Mesopotamia. It was bigger than Sargon's empire, which for some reason is not in this map. I guess since it is a survey level textbook, they didn't think the Akkadian Empire was worth showing, but We're getting into bigger empires here. But then Sargon's empire is toppled in 1595 BC by these people from Anatolia, the Hittites. And the Hittites are part of a much larger group that we're going to discuss later in this chapter. But I guess going with the chronology, let me discuss them right now. So I'm trying to go in chronological order. The Hittites were the first Indo-European group to get down into the Middle East. They came from southern Russia around the Caucasus Mountains. Might be why white people are called Caucasians. I believe it is. And I'm not saying they were necessarily white people. They probably were not white. But what's interesting is that most Europeans come from Indo-European language groups that got their start here around 3000 BCE. And many of them migrated all over Europe. There's a few languages that are not Indo-European. There's only 3 I can think of in Europe that were mentioned. Finnish is not an Indo-European language, nor is Hungarian. Even though it's right in the middle of Europe, it's not an Indo-European language. And Basque, also not an Indo-European language. Every other language in Europe is, and Indo-Europeans pretty much spread over here into Greece. When you get about, I think it was about 2200 BCE or 10,000 or 1000 BC that they hit Greece and Rome. No, 2200 and 1000 BC, Greece, Rome. And then another group went into Germany and France and eventually England and Ireland. But there were other groups that went the other way. In chapter 4, we're going to talk about the Aryans that came down into Pakistan and India and formed the Vedic Age. In chapter 7, we'll talk about the Persians, which came into Iran. They were Indo-Europeans. But the first Indo-European group to really gain independence is the group that came into Turkey, Anatolia, the Hittites. And they took over around 1800 BCE or so. And their big advantage was iron and horse-drawn chariots. And of course, the wheel was invented by the Sumerians over 1,000 years earlier. So the wheel was diffused up here. The horses had been domesticated in the steppe lands of Eurasia. But then when you combine that with the wheel technology from Mesopotamia, you have something deadly called horse-drawn chariots. And then you have iron metallurgy. I know we're talking about the Bronze Age, which is generally what this era before 1200 BCE is. And the Bronze Age is when most metals were bronze, which is basically 90% copper, and I'm going to give you a pun, 10% tin. No pun intended. I'm being silly. Okay, that's my corny side coming in. But anyway, iron metallurgy, the Hittites had a way of doing this that was more efficient and less cumbersome than what others had done. And so iron weapons and horse-drawn chariots give them massive advantages that other people of this area did not have. And so 1595, the Hittites come down and they sack Babylon, 1595 BCE, but they really didn't dominate Mesopotamia much. It was a little bit south of their sphere of influence. We'll go back to the map over here in the book because the purple is the Hittite Empire, and Mesopotamia was pretty far south and east of them. So they sacked Babylon, but I like to joke that the Hittites were a little bit like George W. Bush in the 21st century CE. They could smash it up, but then they couldn't rule it when they got there. I know, I didn't think I'd tell a George Bush joke. I know I was going to tell some Trump jokes in this, but anyway, that's exactly what happened. But the Hittite Empire was at its peak around the 1300s BCE, right when the Egyptians were at their peak. I know it's the Syrian Empire, we're going to get to that, but the Egyptian Empire, you'll see in the next chapter, the Egyptians and the Hittites met right around here in the Levant area, but that's the next chapter. The Assyrians are several hundred years in the future. We're going to get to them next. So the Hittites last till about 1200 BCE, and then they basically collapse. Invasions by the Sea Peoples and some stuff like that. In fact, that's a pretty famous period on our timeline known as the Bronze Age collapse. It's around 1200 BCE. A lot of civilizations start to fall apart, like Mycenaean Greeks. We're going to get to that, and that won't be till chapter 10. We get to the Greeks with the Hittites, fall apart the Egyptian New Kingdom, which will be the very next chapter. They kind of go into decline. Like I say, Mesopotamia at this time is pretty chaotic. After 1595 BC, and until about the 900s, I believe, when the Assyrians start to take power, there's kind of a lot of chaos in that area with no one real dominant ruler. So basically, the Bronze Age collapse is called that because it's the start of the Iron Age, because once the Hittites lost their monopoly on iron weaponry, it diffused elsewhere. So that ends the Bronze Age and begins the Iron Age. And I know I'm going to talk more about both the Israelites and the Phoenicians on the next section. But first of all, Israel and Phoenicia were at their height around 12,800 BCE, which is interesting because it's this 400-year intermediate period where Egypt's declined, Hittites are gone, and the Assyrians have not really risen to power yet. And so you get this intermediate period about 3,000 years ago, and that's the era of King David and Solomon. And yeah, I can go ahead and talk about that because it's in the chronology. I was saving these other subjects for later, but I like to do this in chronological order. But I'll give you more details about those later. I'm thinking on the spur of the moment, okay, I'll skip for now over Israel and Phoenicia, which is modern Lebanon, because those are both very interesting subjects in and of themselves, but they're at their peak around 10,000 BCE, right during the Bronze Age collapse, when the major powers, Egypt and Anatolia, are gone, and the Assyrians have not yet risen to power, which brings us to Assyria, which is not Syria, it's northern Iraq, Ashur and Nineveh. So iron weapons have spread. Now, Assyria has been around since about 1900 BCE. This is another Semitic group. I mentioned the Hittites were Indo-European, but now we're back to Semitic people ruling the area. So basically, once the iron weapons have diffused after the collapse of the Hittite Empire, eventually the Assyrians get them. So I told you about this, but this green, this is 700s, 600s BCE. And as you can see, the Assyrians went everywhere. The Egyptian eras of Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom have all collapsed. So Egypt's in its foreign rulers era. We'll get into that in the next chapter. And one of the foreign rulers was Assyrians in the 7 and 600s BCE. I know that's the next chapter. I mean, look how huge that is. Egypt, Palestine, and Mesopotamia, and modern Syria. They were a massive empire. They were also brutal. The Bible's not very kind to the Assyrians and talks about how brutal they are. In their own history books, they brag about torturing the people they conquered. So definitely not a very good kingdom. Now, we will go back to the Jewish history, because the Jewish kingdom split into two in 922 BCE. Their height, like I say, was about 1000 to 930 BC under David and Solomon when they built the temple. In 922, they split into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. 722 BCE, the Assyrians take Israel when they come in and do all this conquering, and that's where the lost tribes of Israel come from. They get absorbed into the empire. But in 612 BCE, the Assyrian Empire collapsed under its own weight. And the next empire is not in here, but the next empire is the Chaldean Empire, or the New Babylonian Empire. Basically, for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, Babylon resurges right up here. And this is where you have King Nebuchadnezzar and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which may have actually been in Nineveh. It's hard to say. That's a possibility. And the Babylonians also capture the southern tribe of Jewish people in 586 BCE and put them in Babylonian captivity, where they're freed by the Persians in 516 BCE. Speaking of the Persians, that's another Indo-European group. So we're going to come back over to the map, and that's going to be chapter 7. That's my favorite ancient society in what is now Iran. The Medes and the Persians lived here for about 1,000 years, and eventually they unite and they form the Persians under Cyrus, and they go out and conquer and make the biggest empire the world's ever seen. That includes conquering Babylon in 539 BCE, which is where this chapter ends, with the Persian conquest, and then they set the Jewish people free to go back to Palestine and rebuild the temple. So there you have it, 3,000 years of Iraq's history, or Mesopotamian history. So let's see, did we talk about the people in the song? Sargon, Hammurabi, Ashurbanipal, and Gilgamesh. We talked about Sargon, the basket case in the First Empire, the Akkadian Empire. We talked about Hammurabi in the Law Code. We didn't talk much about Ashurbanipal, but he was the biggest Assyrian leader, and his empire was at peak in about 665 BCE, when you saw on the map how much land they encompassed. And of course, Gilgamesh was our catchy opener, and how this all got started. So there you have it, a quick 3,000-year summary and chronology and maps of Mesopotamian history. There it is, concise for you. Now we're going to talk about some other subjects. Trade routes next. Pumped.